Hi, this is Todd Harrold. I was very influenced by Rick Beato, a video that he did last week where he talked about his favorite music and what he grew up listening to. And the music that you hear, the way I understand it, the music that you hear between the ages of like 12 and 20, maybe it's smaller than that, 12 and 18 maybe, or even 16, can be really influential to you as you get older and throughout the rest of your life. And I think that to a certain extent that's true. I wasn't a real rock and roller when I was growing up, and I had some very influential people that hipped me to some things that, and those were the first people that I really believed in, that I really saw the magic of what it'd be like to play music. And I think it's really important that those people existed in my life, and I hope that I'm that for other people, and I hope that other people are that for other people. You don't have to say you're not cool if you can say, check this out. And if it lights somebody up, then you've kind of done your job, because they can carry that for a very long time. But I wanted to talk about some of my favorite albums when I was a kid. I want to start off with Steely Dan. My favorite album of all time for a long time was this one, Asia. Steely Dan, Asia. It came out in the fall of 1977, and I remember I heard the song Peg on the radio with that killer Jay Graydon guitar solo. I was 13 at the time. And Rick Marotta playing those offbeats, those one-hand offbeats that I've always found very challenging. And that the Chuck Rainey on bass on Peg. But the song that really put it over the top for me was Home at Last. I remember hearing that on the prog rock, or I guess you'd call it the freeform radio station here in Fort Wayne, WXKE, back in the fall of 1977. I remember I was in my father's den, and I had the lights off. I was listening to music with the lights off, because yeah. And I heard that Victor Feldman piano thing come in. But wow. That just knocked me out. And of course, the Purdy Shuffle. There's the Purdy Shuffle, the first recorded example of the Purdy Shuffle on Home at Last on this song. There are so many great songs. I personally think the first two songs on the album, Black Cow, featuring killer Victor Feldman electric piano solo, and then the Asia, which is just such an amazing composition. It's such an amazing composition. And Steve Gadd, I heard he did that in one take. I've heard that from more than one source. And I think that's really amazing that he did that in one take. If you haven't checked out Asia yet, it's just some amazing stuff. Paul Humphrey, who played with Marvin Gaye and Lawrence Welk, is on Black Cow. Steve Gadd's on Asia. Bernard Purdy is on Deacon Blues and Home at Last. Rick Marotta's on Peg. Ed Green playing Boom Ticky Boom like 54 times. 54 times on that particular song. I think Zorro hipped me to that when I studied with Zorro. He hipped me to the fact that same fill happened all the way through. And if you check that out, it's like hilarious if you count how many times that fill happens in that song. It's a great drinking game, I guess. But Ed Green on the drums, and Jim Keltner on the drums and the trash can lid. He plays trash can lid, 16ths on the trash can lid on the bridge of Josie. With that amazing Walter Becker guitar solo. It's just an amazing album. But as I've gotten older, the one that I really sort of got into was this one, Royal Scam, which preceded Asia. It came out in 1976. And they don't credit any musicians to songs. You can hear about who did what later, and I've asked some questions. But the guitar solos in particular, and Bernard Purdy's drumming on all but two songs. Rick Marotta plays drums on two songs, but Purdy's on the rest of them. And it's the greatest Purdy. You can just listen to what he does on the hi-hat, and it's just a study in, because he keeps it way back. He puts the beat way back and plays the hi-hat so that it's so deep. That groove is so deep, the way he opens the hi-hat on the ands leading into 2 or 4. Just amazing stuff. And of course, Chuck Rainey played on almost that whole album. He's just his bass playing with Steely Dan was just amazing. As well as if you've ever checked out like Summer in the City by Quincy Jones from the early 70s, or Rock Steady by Aretha Franklin. That's Chuck Rainey, just an amazing player. But there's so many great songs on this album. The first side, both sides. That's what I've come to, is sometimes your favorites change, because that was my favorite album of all time. And I don't know if this one's my favorite album of all time anymore, but it replaced that as my favorite Steely Dan album. But Larry Carlton, of course, is liberally featured on this, and Elliot Randall with that killer guitar solo at the end of Green Earrings. Green Earrings is such a great song, such a great song. And the closing song, The Royal Scam, just an amazing, amazing tune. The way that I don't think I would have been brave enough to put out something that just sort of sits there like that, with the snare on one, with the big beat on one, da 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 one, da da da. You know, most people would have tried to put a regular kind of groove on that, and that was a tribute to them and to Purdy, who played on that, Bernard Purdy, the Royal Scam. This might be my favorite album of all time now. Stevie Wonder Intervisions. He recorded this when he was 23 years old. He played almost all of the instruments on it. He went through a Renaissance period from what we'll call a Renaissance period from 1971 to 1976 or 77, starting with Music of My Mind, where he played almost all the instruments, and then into Talking Book and this album after that, and then fulfilling his first finale and Songs in the Key of Life. Just stunning. And he played almost everything himself. He was a great composer. There's such a variety on here. Too High is kind of a jazz thing. Visions is also more of a ballad. Living for the City, what a great funk song. And Golden Lady, which is almost like a fusion-y type of thing, change-wise. You can tell you've been listening to a lot of Herbie Hancock. Got a killer shuffle with A Higher Ground. Jesus Children of America is just a great song. All in Love is Fair is like a standard. It sounds like a standard. Don't You Worry About a Thing is a Brazilian thing with the samba groove. And He's Mr. Know-It-All. It's just a great big fat kind of Isaac Hayes 16th note kind of thing. Stevie Wonder Intervisions 1973 actually won a Grammy for Album of the Year. So they did something right there. That's cool. I want to talk about Santana at this point, and see if you've heard any of these. These are my favorites. The first Santana that I heard was actually called Moonflower, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. Once again, I heard side 2 of Moonflower on the radio back when they played album sides on the radio, and once again it was in the dark, and I just never heard anything like Carlos Santana. I didn't care who was playing with him. I just never heard anything like Carlos Santana. Just wow. And you could hear his connection to the universe and his God, I think, in his playing. In that sense, it's just really astounding. This I have the painting of this, Annunciation by Marty Clairwine. I just love this album cover. I love Marty Clairwine's painting, and this is such an evocative album cover for such an evocative album. It's just this psychedelic blues, rock, jazz, salsa. Just there's so much going on. Just so much going on. And the first side is one of the greatest album sides of all time. The sort of the Invocation, Singing Winds and Crying Beasts, and then Black Magic Woman and Gypsy Queen, the Peter Green song with the Tito Puente song, and then Oye Como Va, which is Tito Puente song, and then Incident at Neshaber, which has that killer piano by a guy named Albert Giaquinta that I've never heard of anywhere else, but just a killer piano. It's like Ramsey Lewis kind of piano on that. Michael Shreve on the drums and David Brown on the bass, just killer players. Michael Shreve was still very young at this time. Then Santana went into a very heavy spiritual period where you got the guru Sri Chamoy, and got way into meditation and had a different approach in his music. He wanted his music to reflect that. Michael Shreve, I believe, was with Swami Satchidananda at that time, so they were, I believe, that might not be true, that might not be right, but he had a different guru. But they were both sort of documenting their spiritual journey. And it started with this album, Caravanserai, which is fantastic, especially the second side. But it's great that it's a concept album. And man, the percussion on this is just unbelievable. Mingo Lewis and Armando Peraza, just amazing. And of course, Carlos Santana and Neil Schon. And it was this sort of this transition from the first era into the jazzier era. And then there was this album, which was another one big favorite of mine for a while, the Welcome, Santana Welcome, which is deep into the spiritual thing. It's around the same time that they did the live album Lotus that was only available in Japan for years and years. But this features the jazz singer Leon Thomas, who worked with Pharoah Sanders, and Shreve really plays great on this. John McLaughlin is on this album. They've got some odd time signatures happening. They were really kind of challenging themselves. I'm not always a big fan of odd time signatures, but they really work here. They were coming out of the Mahavishnu and like that, and of course everything the Mahavishnu did was pretty much, they were allergic to 4. So, but just some really great playing. Tom Coster is on this album. Tom Coster is one of my favorite keyboard players of all time. I was lucky enough to be able to tell him that too, so that was very cool. I've talked at length to him about that, and that really felt great. It was very inspiring just to meet him, meet the guy who'd done this stuff that meant so much to me. After Welcome was this album Borboleta, where they had started to add in more jazz musicians. It was more of a Carlos Santana album, but it's still just so heavy. It's just so unbelievably heavy. And I return to that music all the time. I got into it when I was 13, 14, 15 because something affected me on a very elemental level when I listened to Carlos Santana play guitar. And it still does. I still love listening to Carlos Santana. And I went to a lot of Santana shows, and they were all amazing because he's amazing. And I want to talk about Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I remember this was cool back in the day. I went to a record store in a mall. I was 13 years old, and I got this for $3.99. This is not the original copy, and an orange Crosby, Stills, and Nash T-shirt. $3.99. It was awesome, man. It was summer of 1977, and I immediately went home and I was really into every song on this album. Russ Kunkel and Joe Vitale are the drummers on this. Russ Kunkel's a really great underrated drummer. I really like playing along with Russ Kunkel. I really like the albums that he's played on. But this is such a great album. Stephen Stills' stuff is really fantastic on this, and David Crosby's two songs are really amazing. David Crosby's always amazing. David Crosby is the man. Let's talk about the first one, where Stephen Stills played almost all the instruments. It came out the bottom there, but Stephen Stills played almost all the instruments himself. On most of those songs. David Crosby and Graham Nash sounded great. It's got Wooden Ships and Guinevere on it, and yeah, I was never a rock and roll guy, but these aren't really rock and roll albums, but I guess you'd call them pop albums. But there's so much going on there. They're so great. Let's talk about the Allman Brothers. The Allman Brothers did two albums back to back. Fillmore East and then Eat a Peach, which they both had live stuff on them. One of the great bands of all time, and Gregg Allman is someone else with just this presence. When I heard him, I think the first Allman Brothers that I really heard that I paid attention to was the song One Way Out, with that vocal thing that he does at the end. And that's an interesting song because the beat turns around about halfway through, and the drummers have to turn around and get back with everybody because they sort of shaved a note. And you usually don't hear that on recordings, but the energy is so fantastic that you just don't care. You just don't care. And then there's that thing that Greg does at the end, which cemented him in my mind as one of the great blues singers of all time. And that's just on One Way Out. That's just on the second album. It's just so amazing. Whipping Post is on here. The way that they structured jams, the way that the guitar players played off of each other. It's two drummers that were really cooking at that time, both of them. And it's just such, and they were their spirit. They were going for it, man. They were really, really going for it. And they didn't always get there. And sometimes I listen and I think, well, what if they had more technical prowess? If they had more technical prowess, that almost would have, I don't know, that I'm not sure that would have made that better. I think that just that kind of unwieldy, is that a word? That's a word. Ness was part of the magic, you know, that, but they were going for it. You could tell they were really into Miles and Coltrane and In Memory of Elizabeth Reed, what an amazing track. So that's Eat a Peach and At Fillmore East. This is the greatest album of all time. This is the one. Kind of Blue, Miles Davis recorded in 2 afternoons in 1959. Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Jimmy Cobb. I can sing every solo on this album to you. I can sing every solo. I can sing all the guitar solos on that Royal Scam album to you too. But I can sing every solo for this. And the way that Miles phrases, every musician should listen to the way that Miles phrases on this album. And just amazing stuff. And it's not fast, and it's not high, and it's not histrionic. It's just cool. It's just the coolest thing you could imagine at that point. And that's what makes this magic. Jimmy Cobb it's not a thrilling drum album. He plays exactly what he should play. And if he played a note more, it would be too many. This is the stuff, man. This is the stuff. This is where so many people were influenced by this album, but this is the stuff, 1959. So I want to talk about John Coltrane. John Coltrane, Love Supreme is the finest John Coltrane album, in my opinion, a concept album. I remember hearing, Love Supreme, Love Supreme. And that took me just those voices. It was all Coltrane, I think. But just those voices coming out of nowhere. I didn't expect that on that album at all. And Elvin Jones with that beautiful Afro-Cuban pattern that he plays on Acknowledgement. There's just so much great playing. And it was a band that was so together. And as you get older as a player, you appreciate bands, you know, just these people who have this amazing chemistry together, you know, and if you take out one of the pieces, it's just not the same. But the first Coltrane that I got hip to was Equinox. That was the first one I heard, and I immediately, being a fan of Kinda Blue by that time, still a teenager, I remember hearing it on jazz radio. I would go to the study hall and I had a little radio and I could tune in. They had jazz at noon. And I can't imagine that now. I was at school and I'm listening to this jazz on the radio in the corner as quietly as I can so people don't complain. But I heard Equinox and it just knocked me out. Just John Coltrane, Equinox. So that was on, I had that on the best of John Coltrane, which was on Atlantic. It was his Atlantic stuff before he did this stuff on Impulse. Which most people think that the Impulse stuff is the best. But I want to talk about a couple of soul albums now that really had an impact on me. First off, Tower of Power Back to Oakland from 1974, and from 1973, I believe, Sly and the Family Stone Fresh. Now, the Sly and the Family Stone is mostly Sly and Andy Newmark on drums, and you should find the YouTube video where Andy Newmark talks about how he got hired for Sly Stone. It's a magnificent story. But Andy Newmark's playing especially on side one of the Sly Stone, is some of my favorite drumming ever. I just love that linear Oakland kind of funk, which Andy Newmark was not an Oakland guy, but he had that down. Just his hi-hat sound and his snare, and the way that he hits the snare and the open hi-hat at the same time on 4, that's a really effective fill. You think about If You Want Me to Stay, you know, boop, 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 doo, doo, right? Sets up like that. Do, 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 do. Just that snare and hi-hat together. What a way to set it up on beat 4. Bang, there you are. Pretty cool, but some great things on here, really cool things, and it's got that low-tech kind of quality that Lenny Kravitz kind of adopted, and Shuggy Otis had, and McCartney, and I like that sound. I really am very attracted to that retro kind of lo-fi kind of sound. I really like that. I think it's cool. But Back to Oakland by Tower Power. This was the first Tower Power album that I had, and I listened to this over and over. I'm such a nerd, and I always have been, that I kept a log of the album sides. I would play along with the album sides, and I keep a log of the album sides that I would play along with. And I remember this was on there like every day. This and the Little Feat, that It's Coming, and Steely Dan stuff. But that was what I practiced. David Garibaldi, just such an enormous influence. And the horn section was so killer. And underrated guitar player Bruce Conti on this album, and of course Chester Thompson on the organ. Chester Thompson was a bad man. I was able to tell him that too. That was cool. So we'll move on. I want to talk about the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper. This is my favorite Beatles. I have a very sentimental attachment to it. I was about 11 years old and I was starting to collect albums. This would have been about 1975, and I really liked Elton John, and so I got this Elton John album called Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and there's Elton John. But there was a song on it about a prostitute, and my mother made me trade it to the guy that lived 3 doors down for a different record, and he traded me the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, which was awesome. And Ringo's playing, I think, is really, really underrated. I also think that Paul McCartney is one of the most talented people who's ever lived. Just amazing. And but Ringo Starr's playing on, like, if you listen to like A Day in the Life at during that part, that groove is so deep. It's so deep. But anyway, the underrated Ringo and Paul and George, that Within You Without You, what an amazing song, especially for that time, to do something that, I mean, you think about, most songs are about, you think about the Beach Boys or the Beatles or She Loves You or, In My Room, and all of a sudden, life goes on within you and without you. Thanks, George Harrison. Kicked us up a notch there, man. Elton John, as I mentioned, Tumbleweed Connection. I had this on 8-track, dig that. And I just love that album. I think the grooves are all really kind of nice and open. Sometimes they use acoustic bass, and I love the guitar playing. I love the sound of that album. It was Elton John trying to sound like the band and Leon Russell, from what I understand. We'll move on to another big favorite of mine, Little Feat Waiting for Columbus. This was one of the other ones that I would keep in my log as songs I played along with. Richie Hayward. The older I get, the better Richie Hayward gets. Richie Hayward was just an amazing drummer. Kenny Gradney, an amazing bass player too. I loved the way that Kenny Gradney played as well. I would, you have ideas in your head when you're younger, and it would have been nice to play with Kenny Gradney, man. And that was not to be, but that would have been nice. Billy Payne on the keyboards. I was a huge Bill Payne fan when I was 14, 15. I was looking for the Bill Payne song because I thought he was the man. I loved Lil George. He was very cool, but Bill Payne seemed to have that thing going on that I was hooked into. Red Streamliner in particular. Red Streamliner was an amazing song. And but this is such an amazing album, especially side 2. Another case where you think, what an amazing band. You couldn't have done anything different. It was so amazing the way that these guys sounded together. And, I'm not sure if they really liked each other, and I know they were kind of excessive, but just, wow, they really had a connection. Really had a connection. Let's talk about Joni Mitchell. I'm going to talk about 3 Joni Mitchell albums. I remember the day that I bought this album. It was in August of 1980. And I took it home and was just absolutely floored, especially by the Pat Metheny solo that goes into Hejira. Hejira is one of the deepest things I've ever heard. Her live version of Hejira, the way that Jaco Pastorius answers her on the bass is just absolutely stunning. I will say I'm not really into Don Elias's drumming on this album. I felt like there was way better drumming on other Joni albums, on most other Joni albums. But the band is so powerful. Michael Brecker is so incredible, and she is just amazing. She just absolutely, she is and was amazing, just amazing. And what a great writer. Got her own sound. Those chords are amazing, and she's such, she does such great stuff. Hissing of Summer Lawns I bought after that because I loved Shadows and Light so much. I might have actually had this one first, but this is such an amazing album with the LA Express. John Guerin and Max Bennett sound wonderful on this album, and Robin Ford and Jeff Skunk Baxter's on here, and James Taylor and Crosby and Nash. Just some amazing stuff. But John Guerin's playing on these albums. This Court and Spark too with Help Me. I love playing drums along with Help Me. I love playing drums along with this album. I think John Guerin's playing was really cool. He plays on the front end of it, on the front end of the beat. So there's that. I'm really working on not doing that myself, trying to pull it back so I can manipulate it more and more as to where the center of the beat is and where behind the beat is. And that, and I hear John on the front of the beat, but that worked for Joni, it worked for her. And just the energy and the way her words would flow, like she didn't have any respect at all for standing, which is cool, for like standard phrasing in the way you phrase a song. She would just, it would go. You think about, what's the name of the song? Edith and the Kingpin, where she ends the line with the same word, like over and over. That's just astounding. That's just great. We'll talk about Zappa. This is the first one that I bought from Frank Zappa, and this is an amazing album. George Duke's on this album. George Duke is so cool. And Napoleon Murphy Brock, although Zappa does most of the vocals himself. But just an amazing, and I'm trying to think of who the drummers were. Is it Guerin on this one too? Yeah, John Guerin's on this. Ainsley Dunbar, Ralph Humphrey, and Jim Gordon. Jim Gordon played on Apostrophe with Zappa and Jack Bruce from Cream. But just amazing stuff, especially if you're a teenager, because, his sense of humor. But, Cosmic Debris, just an amazing tune. And lots of fun. I thought I had the Roxy and Elsewhere album in here too. That's another must-have for him. Traffic, Steve Winwood. I love Steve Winwood. Anything that Steve Winwood does, I'm way hip to. But Jim Gordon played on this album as well, and I really liked those. I associate them with Max Roach, that triplet and fill, that snare rack floor bass. He just plays the hell out of that on the title track. Low Spark High Yield Boys, but just an amazing band that had all sorts of energy. There's things about them that sound like Stevie Wonder, and they sound like Santana, and they just sound like Steve Winwood. I mean, just amazing. Steve Winwood, anything by Steve Winwood. Van Morrison, Moondance. This is my favorite album side, the first side of this album, which is And It Stoned Me, Moondance, Crazy Love, Caravan, and Into the Mystic. Van Morrison is like really responsible, it's coming out the bottom too, really responsible for just really freeing up the kind of the rock vocal the way that one would think about a rock vocalist, because he sang it all sorts of different ways that were unusual, more like a jazz singer. You could tell he was very influenced by jazz singers, but also by soul singers and gospel singers. And the way that he phrased was very unusual. And the way that he would step out and be a soloist as a singer. I'd watch anything where he was doing that, absolutely anything, even if his pitch was off, which it was sometimes live. It just, his ideas were so interesting. They were just so interesting. And sometimes he would run on too long, but that's the nature of searching for something, and that's beautiful. Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus was loaned to me when in January, February of '77, when I was first getting into music. By my father owned a pharmacy, and he had a guy that came in that was studying pharmaceutical law at the time, to work on Monday and Wednesday nights behind the counter. And I worked there at the store on Monday and Wednesday nights, and I found out that he was this really hip dude that had been to the Monterey Pop Festival, and that's pretty cool right there. And just, he was so into music, and he was so into all sorts of music. And he came back the next week after I'd asked him about it with a crate of albums. And right in the front was Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus. This guy's name was Tom Wilson, by the way. Tom Wilson. Great man. Thank you, Tom. And just a whole bunch of stuff he had in there. I remember the Butterfield Blues Band, Horace Silver doing the thing. Oh, those old Blue Note albums are fantastic. What else was in there? Just a whole bunch of stuff. But Mingus was in the front. And it was Mingus and Danny Richmond on the drums. Danny Richmond on the drums, just an amazing drummer. Only played with Mingus and just a few other people, but was mostly with Mingus. Eric Dolphy on the woodwinds, and Ted Curson on the trumpet. And Mingus talks to an imaginary audience in the recording studio. I thought that was amazing. That just blew me away. And then the interaction between he and Danny, and just the way that thing, without a harmonic instrument, without the piano or the guitar, just that two horns and bass and drums, the way that they did that, and his passion, and the way that he seemed to swing in a very, as you could tell he was an intellectual, but he seemed to swing in a very visceral way. And I liked that. I'm not a big fan of the light feeling, as many will tell you, but when it comes to playing jazz, I like those guys that dig in. Let's go, let's go, make it swing. Art Blakey on Moanin', wow, that's deep right there. But anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about. If you want to comment, that's cool. Maybe I'm wrong. Could be.